Slowly, painfully, the English colonies in America began to establish themselves. In a strange new world, the colonists learned they could survive. But was survival enough? To become prosperous, to have a rich and meaningful economy, they would have to begin to solve problems of capital, labor, and transportation, of which they were yet only dimly aware. And because these solutions would take different forms in the different geographical regions, the economy that developed would become surprisingly rich and varied. To exploit the wealth of America, English merchant capitalists organized to form stock companies. If English colonies can be founded in the New World, the colonists can supply the raw materials needed at home, and at the same time consume England's surplus of manufactures. But in the beginning, the colonists can only hope to subsist and survive. In a land teeming with game, many starve to death. Most of all, these first settlers are afraid of the Indians. But if the Indian brought fear and death, he also brought gifts more precious than gold. From the Indian came corn, which would become the great staple of the colonial diet. And from the Indian came tobacco. In 1612, John Rolfe finds a way to sweeten and cure the harsh Indian tobacco and establishes the colony's first important cash crop. Now, as profits begin to pour back into London, Virginia begins to attract more and more people. In 1619, a cargo of 92 women arrive. Single men in Jamestown gladly pay 120 pounds of tobacco for their new wives. Men stop thinking of quick riches and returning to England. Married men plan to raise families and stay. But ironically, their very prosperity brings problems. The profit in tobacco begins to attract a new kind of settler. Wealthy men begin to come to Virginia with plans to raise enormous crops. Richer, more aggressive than the earlier arrivals, these new businessmen planters begin to buy up and acquire the best coastal lands in the Tidewater. More and more forcing the poor farmers back into the wilderness. But these new planters are unable to work their huge plantations alone. They first seek labor in the form of indentured servants who come to America and agree to work for a period of years. Some of these indentured servants come voluntarily in the hope of a better life after they receive their freedom. Some come to pay fines for crimes they have committed. Many come unwillingly, forcibly kidnapped and smuggled aboard ship. The English Parliament authorizes the transportation to the colonies of
rogues, vagabonds, sturdy beggars, and political offenders.
During the colonial period, some 50,000 convicts are transported principally to Virginia, Maryland, and Georgia. Convicted felons have their sentences commuted to 7 to 14 years of servitude. But many convicts and indentured servants run away before their term of service is completed. And as the labor supply from Europe proves inadequate, the wealthy southern planter turns more and more to the Negro. The first Negroes had come to Virginia as indentured servants. But it is difficult and disturbing to train replacements every few years when their period of servitude is over. some white planters begin to ask themselves, why not keep these Negroes permanently? Slavery already exists in South America and on the islands of the West Indies. The Negro makes an ideal slave. If he tries to escape, his color makes it easy to find him. If he is disobedient, he can be punished because he is a heathen. Gradually, Virginia and the other colonies legalize slavery. By 1715, there are 60,000 Negro slaves in America. By 1760, there are over 400,000. Slave labor leads to the rise of two separate Southern economies. Most Southern farmers are too poor to own slaves. But on the rich plantations of the South, slave labor becomes the backbone of the rich planter economy and permits the rise of a luxurious and indulgent way of life. Slaves not only work as field hands and house servants, but are trained to perform every kind of useful service. But while slaves become more and more important to the Southern economy, on the smaller, family-owned farms in New England, slave labor is not so practical or profitable. With a long, harsh winter and a short growing season, the New England farmer planting his rocky acres sometimes barely makes enough to survive. The New England farmer has learned from the Indian to plant a herring as fertilizer with each hill of corn. An early rhyme doggerel tells of the farmer's hope that the birds, the animals, and the other pests will leave some of the corn for his family to eat.
One for the cutworm, one for the crow, one for the woodchuck, and two to grow.
Unable to afford slaves, frequently unable to afford even a part-time hired man, the New England farmer, like the poor Southern farmer, solves his problem in a practical fashion. He raises his own labor force. The fertility of some of these colonists is extraordinary. 20 children in a family is not rare. Many mothers have one child in the cradle, one at the breast, and one on the way. Girls marry young and bear children their entire lives. Even old and ugly women are in demand. A widow who can bring a colonial husband a large, ready-made family is a prize. A New England farmer says that to him, a woman is like an ox.
I like mine big, strong, and ready to work.
Already regional differences demand economic solutions that will have important bearing on the future history of America. Skilled workmen coming to America in search of a better life are reluctant to go south where they will have to compete against the Negro. More and more they tend to go to New England and the middle colonies. With labor scarce and his skills desperately needed, the hired man can demand a high price. Groaning about the rising cost of labor, a New England farmer complains to his hired man that he can no longer afford to pay him.
Then sell your oxen.
And how shall I work my farm after they're gone?
Then you can work for me and earn them back.
If the use of slave labor in the South creates a class without hope, a free working man in the North can, in time, hope to become more prosperous than his former employer. With the soil of New England so rocky, the prosperity of the northern colonies lies in harvesting the seas. The New England colonies early have their fishing fleets. By 1641, New England is exporting 300,000 pounds of dried cod a year. The best fish is preserved, salted, and sold to the markets of England, Spain, and Portugal. The middle grade is eaten at home by the colonists. The worst fish is sold to the West Indies and to the South to be eaten by slaves. And New England fishes not just for food, but for light. From whale blubber comes the oil that lights colonial and European lamps. From the whale comes ambergris, to be distilled into the perfumes so eagerly sought by the unwashed noble ladies and gentlemen of Europe's courts. Hunting the whale becomes so profitable, New England men risk the danger of death. In small boats towed at high speed, whalers thrill to a Nantucket sleigh ride. By the time of the Revolution, 10,000 New England men are engaged in fishing. Another 4,000 in whaling. And to supply the needs of her growing fishing fleets, New England developed shipbuilding and other industries. As early as 1614, a small vessel, the Orient, is constructed on Manhattan Island. In 1631, Massachusetts builds the Blessing of the Bay. With deep virgin forests, the colonists have tall trees to make sturdy masts. All the lumber needed for the stoutest ships. To protect her home industries, England at first tries to discourage this colonial shipbuilding. But the mother country cannot resist buying these cheap, practical, sturdily built, speedy American ships. By the time of the Revolution, 1/3 of all the ships flying the English flag have been built by Yankee craftsmen. By now exclusive of fishing craft, New England herself boasts 2,000 ships. From the needs of fishing has come shipbuilding. To supply the shipbuilders, a growing lumber industry. Supplying barrels and barrel staves, tar and pitch, sails, provisions, and other naval stores, New England begins to develop a rich and varied economy. Forges and iron furnaces had been started in the north early. New England begins a thriving woolen industry, starts to manufacture beaver hats. Seeking new markets for their goods, aggressive Yankee traders begin to find their way to every corner of the world. Yankee ship owners begin to make huge profits in the triangular trade. In this trade, New England fish and lumber, or flour and produce from the middle colonies, is first shipped to the West Indies to be bartered and exchanged for sugar and molasses. The sugar and molasses is then brought to New England, where it is manufactured into rum. And then this cargo is transported to West Africa, where the rum is traded for slaves, who are brought back to the colonies to be sold to the highest bidder. Yankee slave traders begin to get rich, supplying the increasing demand for slaves in the South. Meanwhile, in the middle colonies, the colonial economy develops differently. Here, the soil is not so rocky as New England. The land is richer, the growing season longer. In a more temperate climate, the middle colonies begin to grow and to export huge crops of wheat, barley, oats, and rye. The middle colonies not only ship to England, their surplus crops feed the rest of the colonies. The rich grass nourishes fat cattle. New York and New Jersey raise enormous flocks of sheep. The surplus food feeds endless litters of pigs. The middle colonies are the most varied in population. The Dutch have settled in New York. The Catholics have first colonized Maryland. There are Swedish settlements in Delaware and New Jersey. Then, in 1682, William Penn founds his holy experiment in Pennsylvania. He plans Philadelphia to be a city of brotherly love. He wants gardens to surround each house so that the city would always be wholesome, a green country town. Penn's New Zion becomes a haven not only for Quakers, but for tens of thousands of German Protestants, Lutherans, Moravians, Mennonites, Schwenkenfelders. Some of these new German settlements, like the Moravians, were communal in nature, but most of the Germans were independent, thrifty farmers whose energy and industry turned the limestone region of Pennsylvania into a huge wheat granary. While other colonists frequently used up land because it was so easily available, the Germans practiced conservation, rotated their crops, preserved their trees, attended to irrigation and drainage, and kept their stock fat and sleek. But they were more than farmers. Skilled craftsmen, the Germans built wagons. Their gunsmiths made the best rifles in the colonies. They made Germantown a center of thriving handicrafts. Beer was brewed and cloth woven. The first paper mill in the colonies was set up there. Sauer's printing establishment became famous, as did Baron-Stiegel's iron foundry and glass factory. The middle colonies begin to rival New England in trade and manufacture. By 1760, Philadelphia is the largest city in the colonies, with about 20,000 people. The next great wave of migration brought the Scotch Irish. Finding the best lands taken along the coast, they plunge into the wilderness, buying cheap land at $1 or $2 an acre, or taking it by tomahawk claim. They settle along the frontier, along the eastern fringes of the Alleghenies, in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, and through the Piedmont region in the Carolinas. Living in rude cabins with paper windows soaked in lard or bear's grease, they dress in homespun hunting shirts and deerskin leggings. Their women in fabrics made on spinning wheels and home looms. To get cash, they enter the fur trade, trapping themselves and bartering with the Indians. More and more, the people of the backwoods begin to supply the furs prized by royalty abroad, the skins needed for clothing by the colonists at home. Albany, New York, and Charleston, South Carolina, become trading centers for the fur trade. By the middle of the 18th century, the fur trade is one of the most important industries in the colonies and is responsible for much of the wealth of New York City. By 1750, the American colonies stretch from Massachusetts to Georgia. If a way of life has developed that is different in each of the various regions, 9 out of every 10 people in the colonies still make their living from agriculture. But with growing prosperity, there is more and more emphasis on trade and manufacturing. To increase trade, the colonists have had to solve massive problems in transportation. At first, there are few roads. Most of the early trade between the colonies is by water, by canoes and small boats down rivers, by schooners along the coastal highway. But gradually, Indian trails become roads and turnpikes. From the earliest days, there had been central markets in important towns. Now peddlers penetrate more and more into even the most remote areas. Most of the overseas trade continues to be with England. London merchants buy the complete harvest of the southern tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations. In return, they extend credit in London for anything the planter wishes in exchange. By the time of the Revolution, Thomas Jefferson estimates that the pleasure-loving Virginia planters owe their London agents over £2 million, 20 times the amount of actual money in the colony. But while some southern colonies do almost all their overseas trade with England, the middle colonies do only 50% of their overseas trade with the mother country. And New England ships only 1/4 of her goods to England and imports less than half her needs. What stifles and almost stops colonial, domestic, and overseas trade is a chronic shortage of cash. From the beginning and until the Revolution, England had denied the colonists the right to make their own money. The colonists had been forced to rely on barter, on Indian wampum, and the illegal minting of coins, such as the pine tree shilling. One result of the currency shortage is that while the colonists pass laws punishing piracy, the chronic shortage of cash makes them welcome freebooters who bring needed silver and gold coins. And as England passes more and more laws in restraint of trade, smuggling becomes an accepted way of life in the colonies. Some of America's most prominent families grow rich by smuggling. By the time of the Revolution, the American colonies are vigorous and thriving. A prosperous economy is developed, which has had to overcome massive problems of capital, labor, transportation, and currency. But from the beginning, there has been an even greater problem: mercantilism. From the beginning, England saw the American colonies as a storehouse for raw materials, while she herself could grow rich, supplying the colonists with manufactured goods. Thus, England early gave the colonists bounties to produce things she desperately needed: masts, tars, potash, and naval supplies. But at the same time, the mother country carefully guarded her own prized industrial secrets. Under penalty of death, it was forbidden to export to the colonies one of the new weaving machines or the plans for making such a machine. As the colonial economy developed, England passed more and more harsh rules against colonial manufacturing. By 1699, Parliament passed the Woolen Act, requiring that colonial yarn and cloth not be shipped or sold outside the colony where it was manufactured. By 1732, she passed the Hat Act to suppress the exporting of beaver hats. The Iron Act of 1750 limited the sale of iron products to the colony in which they were made. But if the mother country is determined to maintain an unfair mercantile system, determined to throttle the colonial economy and stifle manufacturing, America has bred a people determined to resist. Evasion of unjust laws leads to smuggling. Smuggling leads to open defiance. Open defiance leads to armed rebellion. The coming conflict will determine whether the colonies will continue to be simply a storehouse to supply England with raw materials, or whether the American economy and American industrial power would continue to grow and become the equal of any in the world.